Hello everybody and welcome to this Transactions on Computer-Human Interaction paper that I will present here at the SIGCHI conference. This paper is authored by myself, Roelof Vries, and Mailin, Lemke, and also Geke, Ludden. The title of the paper is Blueprints, Systematizing Behavior Change Designs, the Case of Social Comparison Theory. So in this paper we will introduce a new tool or approach, or a new intermediate level knowledge if you will, that we call blueprints, that we hope will help to systematize and formalize the process of designing based on behavior change theory. And to showcase this, we tested this idea with social comparison theory and some designs for social comparison theory. With this paper, we aim to make a theoretical contribution to the field of behavior change design by introducing a blueprint for social comparison theory in particular, and in general, blueprints as a new form of intermediate level knowledge to be used for future studies and designs. But first, let us have a look at why we think blueprints are needed and useful. To improve people's lives, human-computer interaction and design researchers are increasingly designing technological solutions based on behavior change theory. The use of theory in design has always been a hotly discussed topic. The current discourse around the value of theory in design can be broadly separated into two main groups. The pragmatic camp, which highlights the designerly ways of knowing that are often tacit, and they argue that the role of theory is merely to inspire, reflect, and help a designer in practical choices, but not to serve as a basis. And the scientific camp, which emphasizes that design decisions should be based on theoretical principles and models, and they focus on the grounding and justification of design decisions. In our specific context, we argue that theories for behavior change design, which are behavior change theories, are a special use case. Because in most cases in this context, people think a specific behavior change theory accurately describes how people change their behavior, and therefore using or implementing a specific theory or behavior change technique will evoke a specific behavioral response that they want. From this point of view, theories in this context cannot be reduced to just a source of inspiration if the specific behavioral response is still expected to be evoked. We argue that theories instead should be seen as a basis for design requirements to enable the intended effect. So, in a similar vein as behavioral science, where it is common practice to base behavior change interventions on theories or models of behavior change, HCI and design researchers are also basing their technological interventions on behavior change theories or models. Ideally, with theory-based interventions in behavioral science, an inference loop is established where theory can help guide and ground the process of designing an intervention, and in turn, the evaluation of the intervention can help evaluate and inform the theory, shown below here with a picture from clinical psychologist Paul Mailin, which shows that theory can inform a hypothesis, which in turn can be tested with observations, and these observations then can tell you something about the hypothesis, which in turn can tell you something about the theory, and around it goes. Similar to behavioral science, we, in this context now behavior change designers, would want to have an inference loop as well. But in our case, our designs or our artifacts function as the hypothesis. A certain theory would inform a design, which equals the hypothesis, and we would do some observations to tell us something about our design hypothesis, which in turn would tell us something about the theory. Unfortunately, for behavioral scientists and HCI and design researchers alike, behavior change theories are usually not sufficiently specific enough to offer a basis for an intervention for behavioral scientists, let alone for the functional basis of a design for HCI and design researchers. And what happens then in turn is that these designs or implementations that are loosely based on theory are usually not informative enough to help in evaluating or reflecting on the theory. And if you cannot establish well enough how a design or a hypothesis is related to theory, an evaluation of this design or hypothesis can in turn also not tell you much about the theory it was supposedly based on. A common practice in HCI and design literature to contextualize our results is to include a section outlining the implications for design based on a specific study's findings. but there is often a lack of explanation on how a design was grounded in a specific theory in the first place, and how this influenced the evaluation process. This is perhaps not surprising considering behavior change theories are not sufficiently specific. However, the lack of explanation on operationalization practices and the lack of specificity in behavioral theories leads to the design process in this context seemingly taking place in a kind of black box. We do not really know what researchers are doing or how researchers are doing it. Tools and methods that could facilitate making this black box more transparent seem to be scarce. There have been attempts to bridge the gap between practice and theory in the form of so-called intermediate levels of knowledge, and most intermediate levels of knowledge often have a bottom-up perspective, focusing on the pragmatic view of abstracting findings from prototypes, and just a few have focused on the scientific view of theory and design simultaneously to develop more abstract levels of knowledge. It is our belief that a clear description of and a systematic approach to the grounding process of design elements in a specific theory would allow researchers to replicate or reproduce relevant components. It would open up the design space for the formation of more abstract knowledge and hopefully support the inference loop for the development of more effective and functional behavior change designs. With this paper, we aim to address this gap by providing a tool that can be used in the design development and reflection process to point out which and how functional elements of a design are based on a specific theory. This tool, or intermediate level knowledge, is what we call blueprints. We termed our tool blueprints as a metaphor for a common blueprint needed to construct a specific object. A typical blueprint is a technical drawing that contains all the essential elements to reproduce the depicted design rapidly and accurately without containing unnecessary information. They are signified by details that can be described as sufficient and necessary. The idea behind our intermediate level knowledge blueprint is that it specifies the essential or minimal building blocks needed to represent the theory, like a high fidelity representation or operationalization of theory. We define minimal building blocks as functional elements that are simultaneously sufficient and necessary. Sufficient means that the defined building blocks are enough to embed the functional elements of a specific behavior change theory. Necessary means that the building blocks are all separately needed to allow the intended effect of the theory. As there might be different definitions of a theory, we focus on it being based on a particular definition of the theory. We focus on social comparison theory for the operationalization of a behavior change theory into a behavior change design, and to illustrate the development and use of a blueprint. The blueprint we present in this paper and in the next slides is based on and restricted to social comparison theory. However, we argue that the concept of blueprints we propose can be applied to other theories of behavior change. Due to the varying degrees of complexity of some of these theories, it seems likely that some of them are more challenging to attempt to create a blueprint for than others. We approached this development of a blueprint in two steps. First, on the one hand, we wanted to understand the breadth and depth of social comparison theory, and on the other hand, also the way social comparison theory is currently operationalized in behavior change designs. Second, we tried to determine the essential building blocks of set designs and of the theory to develop a blueprint of social comparison theory that other researchers can refer to. We therefore focused on two different research questions. Research question 1, how is social comparison theory being applied in designing behavior change technologies? And so research question 2, what are the minimal building blocks needed to describe a social comparison design? We address research question 1 with a scoping review into the CHI and DIS conferences to gain an understanding of the social comparison theory and how it's used as part of behavior change designs in HCI and design literature, and how the operationalization process is described. We leave the detailed answer to this research question to the paper, but as a brief summary, we can say that the explanation of the operationalization process of social comparison as part of HCI and design literature is very limited. And of course, this does not mean that researchers did not follow a specific process for this operationalization. It merely means that it was not clearly described in said papers. There's no clear description and methodology for the operationalization and grounding process for theory-based behavior change designs. To address research question 2, we followed an iterative design process to develop a blueprint that sufficiently represents social comparison for behavior change. To address our second research question, we argue that a behavior change design should contain functional elements that need to be embedded in a design to allow for the social comparison effect to take place. To this end, we argue that we should first focus on what is essential, or in other words, what are simultaneously necessary and sufficient functional elements that allow a person to engage in social comparison through the design. These functional elements, which we refer to in this paper as building blocks, form the blueprint for social comparison theory. The process of creating a blueprint was conducted in multiple steps. We began the process by choosing a simple definition of social comparison theory as our starting point. Although this definition might not represent the full extent of the high-level theory that is social comparison theory, it does provide a concrete starting point to discuss whether designs do or do not represent the intended functionally minimal definition. You can read more about our process in the paper. You can also find there more explanation on the systematic steps for a generic blueprint that we abstracted and that is illustrated here on the slide. Following our process, we came to a blueprint of social comparison theory. The first essential building block for our social comparison blueprint we found was data points, which is, in its most minimalist version, 2 data points to allow for comparison. The following essential building block we determined was an identifier to link the data point to a user. The third essential building block we determined was the comparison dimension to link the data to a direction. When we assessed the design's intended effect, we noticed that such a design allows the user to compare, but the data is still uninterpretable. For example, a design in this state leaves unclear what unit is used for these scores. And moreover, it is still unclear who the 2 identifiers relate to. Therefore, the subsequent 2 building blocks that we added were a clear indication of the unit to allow the user to interpret the data points, and an identity for the 2 identifiers, thereby clearly stating which identifier is the user. Reflecting on this iteration, we argue that the user could engage in basic comparison, but still the anticipated behavior change goal is left unclear. Using social comparison to induce a behavior change as part of a design needs to make this component explicit to guide and influence the user's behavior in an intended way. To facilitate behavior change as part of a behavior change design, we added the additional building block objective. Based on the results of the steps presented, we can address research question 2, what are the minimal building blocks needed to describe a social comparison design, which is our final blueprint. Our final blueprint consists of 6 building blocks. Who is involved in social comparison is covered by 2 blocks of identity and identifier. What data is used to allow comparison is covered by the 2 blocks of data points and unit. And lastly, the overall goal of the design is covered by the 2 building blocks of comparison dimension and objective. These minimal building blocks all adhere to the simple definition of social comparison that we used as a starting point. In concluding this work, we return to our starting point, which illustrated the need to develop a systematic approach to justify and develop design solutions that effectively incorporate theory. Making the process clear allows justification of the level of rigor applied to the methods and rationale for decisions made. We acknowledge the importance of the development of design prototypes as specific instances or ultimate particulars. Still, we also need tools that help bridge the area between theory and these particular instances to clarify and abstract research findings and overall contributions. As many studies use or adapt constructs from more than one theory, the operationalization process so far seems to rely on the designer's discretion. Our argument is not that these design decisions are wrong, but that there is a need to make the decisions explicit, specifically in fields where one would like to do inferencing between theory and instance, such as in behavior change design. Or As Olaswurtu and Hornbeek put it, this does not mean rejecting the reality and value of designerly ways of knowing. It means that in order to build a bridge to theory formation and empirical research, design cannot treat theories as mere opinions and inspirations. We would like to think blueprints can facilitate this. Thanks for listening.